Leader.
Yesterday, British Columbians were horrified by the chilling images of Paul Schmidt's fatal stabbing in Vancouver. This senseless and deadly random attack occurred in broad daylight. It occurred outside of a Starbucks on Granville Street, a busy coffee shop that many of us in this chamber, myself included, and countless British Columbians and visitors to our province have frequented. Paul was there with his wife and his young daughter. The images of his attack and his death are chilling, and they're nothing short of tragic. As a father who often visits coffee shops with his wife and daughters, I'm finding it hard on behalf of the opposition to find words to describe what Paul's family must now endure. The violence that's taking place in our communities is getting worse and worse. And Mr. Speaker, random attacks, which used to be a rare occurrence in British Columbia, have sadly become all too common, almost to the point of being normalized in our province. So my question to the Premier is this: how many more lives must be shattered by this abhorrent, senseless violence before we see an end to these horrific random attacks?
Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. All of us share the absolute horror, and words can't, I think, describe the feeling of just how awful what happened outside that Starbucks is, and how disturbing the images, which sadly have been shared on social media, and just how horrible that must be for the family, friends of the family, and for the public in general. But I also want to make it clear, this is a problem that is not, this upsurge that we have seen is not something that is unique here in British Columbia, but is something we are seeing indeed in all parts of the country, particularly our larger cities. And I can tell you that it is something that the province, this province and other provinces are working on ways to be able to deal with these situations, particularly because of their random nature. It's why we continue to invest in supports that police have been asking for. It's why we continue to advocate at the federal level for changes in the criminal code, particularly when it comes to dealing with weapons. In this case, knives, which is something that this province and other provinces have been calling for. But it also means, as a government, to continue to be committed to working with local governments, local police agencies, other provinces and the federal government to come up with new, different initiatives to keep our public safe, but recognizing that this challenge in particular around random stranger attacks there is not been to date an easy solution, but certainly it is one that we are determined to work to find a way to ensure that our streets and our communities are safe, because no one should have to feel unsafe. And certainly what we saw, I think, as the member said quite rightly, I think shaken all British Columbians. This government remains committed and we will do everything we can to keep our streets safe.
Opposition House Leader supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, people don't feel safe in British Columbia today, and that's because they aren't safe in our communities. Certainly not like they used to be. And tragedies like this require more than condolences. The Premier promised, and I quote, results that people could see and touch and feel, end quote, as a commitment towards addressing these dire public safety concerns and realities faced by British Columbians. But every single day, there is another horrific story of brutal, random attacks and violence. And Mr. Speaker, what's happening is a direct result of the policy choices of this government for the past 6 years. This is happening under the Premier's watch. A Premier who was the Attorney General for 5 years and now is the Premier of British Columbia. Last week, it was a series of assaults and knife-point robberies here in downtown Victoria. The man stabbed a person and then went on to randomly rob and assault 3 others at knife point in separate incidents. This brazen random violence unfolded within 5 blocks in the downtown area before police, thankfully, were able to tackle the knife-wielding suspect to the ground. Mr. Speaker, it's no wonder that 79% of Victoria residents in a recent survey answered that don't feel safe in the downtown here. Again, the Premier was the Attorney General for 5 years in this province. The Premier at that time was the person obviously in charge of our failing justice system, and he is now the Premier. People deserve better than the Premier's endless cycle of catch and release. So again, to the Premier, when will this vicious violence, these random attacks, finally end in communities across British Columbia?
Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member, and I appreciate their concern around public safety. But I also think it's important that we make it clear, because police have made it clear that the challenges that they face are multifaceted. There is the issue of the random stranger attacks, which we saw so horrific yesterday, which leave all of us shaken. And I said, we are working as hard as we can with law enforcement authorities and other governmental authorities to come up with strategies to try and deal with that. At the same time, there are other public safety issues, and the member references those in his second question, where there has been considerable initiatives undertaken by this government over the last 6 years to deal with the challenges that we face here in British Columbia, but indeed right across the country. It's why, in terms of people who have a violent past or have committed violent offences in the past, it was this government that led the initiative to go to Ottawa and to seek changes to the criminal code on reverse onus to toughen up bail conditions so that people aren't released when they pose a danger. It was this government that sought as broad a definition as possible on that reverse onus, so that it includes knives, that it includes weapons, that it includes bear spray, that it even includes histories of those who have engaged with a weapon in the past. And we got that commitment from the federal government that they will make those changes. And the expectation is those changes are for this session. It is this government that put in place initiatives in our recent budget around specific care teams designed to monitor violent offenders when they are released from a correctional facility and prior to their contact with the justice system. It is this government that expanded the CAR program, $87 million for additional resources for monitoring of violent offenders and giving the police additional tools. It is this government that has put in place the funding over 3 years to fill the provincial RCMP vacancies in small and rural communities, Honourable Speaker. We have undertaken significant initiatives and we will do others. But the situation that we have been facing in this province and other provinces is complex. And we need to understand and recognize that. But make no mistake and no doubt, we are committed to doing everything we can to keep our communities safe.
Member for Abbotsford West.
Thanks, Honourable Speaker. Well, we hear those words again today, horrible and tragic, and they are all too appropriate, and we are hearing them all too frequently. I think with the greatest respect, Mr. Speaker, what people are looking for from the government, from the Premier, is acknowledgement that what they are doing isn't working. In fact, what they're doing, in many instances, has made the situation worse. I think people understand that there are going to be slight variations in crime rates. But, Mr. Speaker, the fact remains that this Premier as Attorney General and as Premier, has presided over a steady and dramatic increase in random violence in this province, to the point where people across BC no longer feel safe in their neighborhoods. You've heard again here in Victoria. Noah Stinson embarks on another crime spree, robbing, stabbing. An individual who over the past few years has been charged with assaults, drug trafficking, resisting police. But he's out there again, terrorizing people, despite being wanted on a warrant and despite having a weapons prohibition applied to him. So last year, the Premier was dragged kicking and screaming into adopting a new approach to bail. Now, the government claims that it is tracking closely, that it is monitoring and has data relevant to the impact that change is having on public safety. The question is a straightforward one for the Premier. Having monitored, having that data, will they release that data to the people who are desperate in this province, British Columbians who are desperate to see whether or not it is having a positive impact in improving safety in their communities?
Attorney General.
I want to thank the member for that important question. As everybody knows here, we've been taking action to improve the safety in our communities, and that does include issuing a directive to Crown Council. That directive was set under the laws that we currently have, but at the same time we were advocating for changes to that law at a federal level. Minister Farnworth and I met with Minister Leddy, Minister Medicino in Ottawa, and we joined ministers from across this country that were there to seek changes to the bail laws, the unintended consequences that we've seen when it comes to people committing acts of violence, being released on our streets. I'm happy to know or to hear that they made commitments to those changes, to make those changes as early as the spring. We'll be watching to make sure that those changes are made. And at the same time, we'll be watching them and monitoring our directives and how they're showing up in this province. We're using every tool in our toolkit in our justice system to improve the situation for communities across BC. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just a reminder to members when we are mentioning the members and ministers in the House, not to be named. Member for Abbotsford West, supplemental.
Thanks, Honourable Chair. Again, with the greatest respect, the attorney didn't address the essence of my question. The stories are endless, and that is part of the problem. In my own community on the weekend, a prolific offender, notorious prolific offender, apprehended less than 24 hours after having been released, and the police issuing a statement. At the time of Mr. Fontaine's arrest, he had just been convicted of possession of stolen property, another stolen vehicle, yet he was released back into our community not even 24 hours later. And there is story after story after story with all too often tragic endings involving innocent victims. The ministry, back in January, the spokesman said, in the aftermath of the change directive, which the government, I have to say, took an awfully long time to adopt despite having had a recommendation and support from the opposition almost a year previously. The ministry says in January, we're monitoring, we have data. The minister herself a few weeks later said, we are monitoring, we have data. Well, I can assure the Premier and the Attorney that British Columbians are interested to know what that data tells them, because all they see right now is a massive increase in random attacks. So we FOI. We believe the minister when she says there's data that they're monitoring, the ministry spokesman, and we FOI the material. And what do we get back? A refusal. A refusal to release basic information relevant to determining whether or not safety in our communities is improving. I can't reconcile that with a legitimate, genuine effort on the part of the government to convey to British Columbians that they're making all of the efforts necessary to improve their safety. So the question is a straightforward one. I hope the attorney will answer it today. Having confirmed repeatedly that this information is being collated, collected, that there is a monitoring, will she undertake to this House to release that information today?
Attorney General.
Thanks for the question. The BC Prosecution Service is an independent body that has their own monitoring program. I'll leave it to them to answer what data they're able to release. But what I will say is that this government is not just taking the steps that I said about advocating to Ottawa. We're standing up a repeat offenders teams. So these are teams of police officers, probation officers, and Crown Counsel that are working together in a way that was in 2012, but unfortunately that program was cut, and what it saw was a 40% reduction in repeat offending. So we're using that as an example of taking taking action to stop repeat violent offenders in our communities. Those will be operational very soon across the province, and it'll be another measure that we're taking to increase safety in our communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
House Leader of Third Party.